Good afternoon, delegates, guests, and speakers. Welcome to BioAfrica Convention 2022. I'm Vusile Pani, the Executive Bioeconomy at the Technology Innovation Agency. We are a proud partner in the BioAfrica Convention, and we've been so for a few years now. A warm welcome to the Health Innovations in the Age of Pandemics track 1. Where you are now, we will continue with our track from this morning and hear contributions from selected speakers. Our first session this afternoon is entitled Pharmaceuticals and will be facilitated by Dr. Muthobi Godfrey-Kele. We will hear perspectives on the pharmaceuticals industry, on IP and reimbursements. This will be followed by a session entitled Diversity in Clinical Trials, facilitated by Professor Janine Schofield and sponsored generously by Amgen, for which we are grateful. This session will address aspects on the selection of diverse participants, pharmacovigilance, and ancestral diversity. And we will hear perspectives from clinical trials experts and the regulator, SAPRA, on how the pandemic has shaped these perspectives. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Pan. Afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and members of the LGBTQI community. All protocol observed. My name is Muthobi Godfrey-Kele. I am the head of Government Affairs and Policy at Innovative Pharmaceutical Association of South Africa. I welcome this opportunity to facilitate this session on quite critical national discourse. There are two things that just warrant that I effect a small change, yet a very important one. We are still in the month of August, which in South Africa is Women's Month, which we continue to celebrate. And we just came out of a session right now about women in leadership. And I look at my eminent panel of experts, and you can see something is just not right. We've just spoken about dismantling the barriers and patriarchy and everything. So, not out of favor or empowering anybody, I am going to invite and use my prerogative as a facilitator to invite Ms. Vuyokazi Mjekula to come and join us here on stage to engage in the discussions that we're going to engage on with us. So we start now to do away with an all-male dominated environment. So can we please give a round of applause? So ladies and gentlemen, of course, the sub-theme for this afternoon is healthcare innovation in the age of pandemics. So I just wish to clear something right up front so that the speakers can just really get onto the issues that they need to talk about. We are aware that there are 25 countries in March 2021 that approached the World Health Organization in terms of Article 21 of its constitution to ask that an international treaty be developed that can help us deal efficiently with issues of pandemics and to better predict them in future. And we all know that South Africa did well. I think it was during the third wave where we were able to share with the world one strain. So that work is afoot at the World Health Organization. As a matter of fact, there's an intergovernmental negotiating body that has been put together, and that is co-chaired by a former DG of Health here in South Africa, Precious Matsuso. So that work is going on, and it's expected that in 2024 it will be completed. So what we're going to do now is that we're going to deal with the here and now of innovation in pharmaceuticals. We're going to do so by way of tackling four rather pressing topics. Amongst them, the national health insurance. Is there a room for innovative pharmaceutical industry under the national health insurance? Issues related to intellectual property right. Of course, we've gone, there was quite a topical issue in our media landscape about the TRIPS waiver, which we all know about. We're going to talk about intellectual property rights. And we're going to talk about issues related to access, as well as reimbursement of pharmaceuticals, innovative pharmaceuticals. To help me unpack these issues, ladies and gentlemen, I have a privilege of having with us Professor Tini Stander, Dr. Jacques Neyman, Dr. Sibanda, McLean Sibanda, and Prof. Alex van die Heever. And of course, we've got Ms. Vuyokazi Mjekula. So I am going to start first with Dr. McLean Sibanda. The profiles apparently, or rather the bios that are on the website are outdated. So if any of the speakers feels they want to correct their bio, please do offer quick remarks. You have less than 10 minutes. Dr. Sibanda, if you can take us through intellectual property rights, please. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Godfrey. I've got a presentation. I'm not sure whether it's ready to be loaded. That's not mine. So whilst you're finding, the presentation, I've decided to, perhaps entitle my contribution this afternoon to be patents and finding the access balance in pharmaceuticals. And I will not deal with the issues of the IP waiver. I do have some views. Happy to share those if specifically asked. As has already been said, the issues around the IP waiver, there's still ongoing debate. So, are you able to find the slides? Okay, I'll talk. Let me perhaps continue. So one of the things that the importance of this particular discussion is really looking at the burden of disease. And we heard, this morning from the plenary, the role of pharmaceuticals and the role of innovation in addressing the burden of disease. We've seen also a shift, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, from communicable diseases to non-communicable, diseases. And the decline, in essence, in terms of communicable diseases has also been attributed to the interventions from pharmaceuticals. So innovation has contributed to the reduction of the disease burden. Yet at the same time, there are other diseases that still don't find much investment in because they do not affect a huge population. But even in those particular areas, we've seen some innovative approaches by pharma and other companies to be able to address that. So looking forward, moving forward, we're seeing more lifestyle diseases, and in those areas, there will be a need indeed for pharmaceuticals to address the disease burden. I don't know where I need to press. Yeah, that's not mine. So there is significant investment in research and development that pharma continues to make. The first part of this particular slide looks into that in terms of the huge investment into innovation. And what is quite important is that innovation will not happen without investment in research and development. Now that research and development has got to be funded by someone. For those that attended Science in the City yesterday, there was also a clarification that governments in essence fund science. science component, but business and pharma comes in to be able to fund the innovation aspects. On the right-hand side of this slide is really the development path. So it does take quite a while, 3 to 6 years in terms of non-clinical development, and thereafter about 6 to 7 years in respect of clinical development, phase 1 to phase 3, and then registration of the drugs, and then marketing. That particular timeline is expensive. Somebody has got to be funding that. When we talk about patents, the patent area or the stage of patenting happens to be much earlier at research and discovery. And so by the time the drug actually gets to market, a lot of the time is actually gone, because the 20 years for the validity of a patent gets counted from the time that the first application is filed. So it's actually quite important for one to understand the development path to be able to then also get an appreciation of the role of patents in this particular regard. Now, and I think the danger of also talking to a mixed crowd is that you do not know what people do know. So if I go back to the basics, please do excuse me. But the basic philosophy around a patent is that a patent is a right that is given by a government to an innovator in return for that particular innovator disclosing how the invention is carried out. You have to disclose it to a point that a person that is skilled in the art is able to reproduce the invention that is a subject of protection. And if you do that, then the government gives you protection. So as such, there's no such thing as a worldwide patent, so you cannot get a global patent. You can file an application through PCT that covers a whole range of countries, but eventually you have to go to different countries to obtain final patent protection. And when you do that, then the requirement is that it must meet the 3 main requirements. It must be new, it must be non-obvious, and it must have industrial applicability. And then you get protection for 20 years from the date on which you file in the particular country, subject to you paying renewal fees and maintenance fees, and also subject to other events. If your patent gets challenged during that time successfully so, then you lose the patent protection. So in essence, you don't need a patent to be able to practice your invention. And one of the advice that we often give is that if it can be reverse engineered, then perhaps a patent is not, if it can be reverse engineered quite easily, well, then maybe you need a patent. If it cannot be reverse engineered easily, perhaps a trade secret becomes important. I think that becomes quite critical, because most of the drugs that you actually see, there's a patent component, there's a know-how component, which is really a trade secret. And so to patent or not to patent is a business decision, and the rights that you get is to exclude other people from doing the 5 acts that are on the screen. Now, how do we then achieve balance through access to patents? So the first one is really commercialization by the owner. So people would come up with an invention or an invention in essence, because it only becomes an innovation once it finds its use in the market and it is being utilized. And therefore the inventor, and it could be an organization, then starts to commercialize that themselves, and they take it through to market and bring a drug to market or some other therapeutic to market. The other way is that they may decide that the investment that is required is too huge, and therefore want to farm this out, and therefore it's licensed out to third parties who then do the development further, or they could then go into a joint venture with other people and therefore access certain capabilities for them to be able to take the idea through to market. In other cases, it's a complete assignment where the rights move from the original owner to a third party, and that's through assignment, or technology transfer, where it's transferred to somebody else to be able to commercialize. And we've also seen where the IP is made available to patent pools, and that way it also facilitates access and development. There's another form which we find in TRIPS. So TRIPS flexibilities provide a way to allow for countries to tailor-make their laws so that they can be able to meet the development needs. And we find that in Article 30 of TRIPS, and in terms of the meeting today, what would be important in terms of those flexibilities is the research flexibility, where one can be able to undertake scientific research of a patented product or patented invention without fear of infringement, because the law allows for research exemption. The other one is, in essence, allowing for entry for generic industry, and this is typically what is called the BOLA provision, where one is able to undertake certain work and manufacturing in order to obtain regulatory approval before the expiry of an existing patent. And I think the most important one to me is really what we call inbound technology, where it could be patents that have expired or patents that are in the public domain, and also in certain cases patents that are still valid and in force, and it becomes a mutual agreement, voluntary licensing, to be able to license those particular patents. So in the last two slides, I just want to perhaps zoom in and look at South Africa. One of the things that the South African government has consistently done over perhaps a 20-year period is to recognize the importance of patents. I stand here and I think one of the important things to understand is that a strong patent system is better than a weak one, particularly at the level of development where South Africa finds itself. But I also refer to the TRIPS agreement and the TRIPS flexibilities and submit that for countries that are less developed, it's important for them to fully utilize the flexibilities. They do not necessarily need to strengthen their laws quickly. They need to actually take their time and understand the flexibilities and the timeframes that are provided within TRIPS. So looking at South Africa, the investment that the South African government has made into the pharmaceutical, into the biotech sector from about 2002 has resulted in pockets of excellence. And in the slide, you can see these are patents that come out of universities and science councils in South Africa. And most of them are in the life sciences and biotech sector. And therefore, they are pockets of excellence. And the big question is, how do we then take advantage of the IP system and the patent system and these pockets of excellence to be able to fast-track the development of new drugs, new treatments, and new diagnostics, et cetera, is to also identify valid patents in other countries, perhaps not protected in South Africa, and start to allow for technology transfer into South Africa. In certain cases, it could be patents that have already expired in other countries, so they're out in the public domain, but the know-how still resides with the owners of those particular patents, and therefore start to facilitate the transfer of the know-how into South Africa. And so just to conclude is that there's perhaps 4 areas that to focus on. One is a domestic pharmaceutical manufacturing industry. How do we ensure that we don't rely on importation because that has got an impact on price, it's got an impact on access, and how do we strengthen the pharmaceutical research and manufacturing capacity so that we're able to produce what we need. And secondly is increasing awareness of the patent system and understanding that patents are not bad instruments, but the patent system can be utilized to be able to achieve the development goals. And then thirdly, partnerships are very critical in achieving access. And access cannot be achieved solely through legislation or regulation. Partnerships are critical. And the last point is to ensure that there's a balance in respect of policies. And the case of Vericam in Zimbabwe is a critical one, where the government put out a compulsory license, and Verichem were able to produce ARVs, but the price at which they could land those ARVs in the market was higher than the ARVs could be imported, largely because of duties on raw materials. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sibanda, for that excellent presentation. So, colleagues, what we're going to do, we'll just take one presentation after the other. The next one is going to be Professor Alex van den Heerwe. He's going to speak to us about NHI. So what will happen next is after everybody will have spoken, then we'll have 10 minutes of Q&A. And then when it comes to Professor Tini Stander, as well as Dr. Jack Sneyman, who's joining us virtually, it's going to be a roundtable discussion, and this is where I will defer to my colleague Vuyokazi Mjekula to facilitate that dialogue between the two gentlemen who will be talking essentially on similar or related topics. Thank you very much. Can we please welcome Prof. Alex?
Hi, good afternoon. I assume for many people, they've heard quite a bit about this idea of national health insurance in South Africa and have no real idea of what's kind of in the framework or what is really part of that discussion. So what I'm going to do is just provide some clarification on what the proposal is, and then discuss what I think is actually going to happen going forward, and then and within that context discuss the issue of pharmaceutical pricing and procurement. So national health insurance has been proposed as a single purchaser model for South Africa, and you would have heard that language in a lot of the discussions. And what that means is that there's a proposal in South Africa that there will be only one buyer of healthcare. And what that would imply is that our other two big systems for providing healthcare would actually be centralized or consolidated at the national level of government. So South Africa has a very large public health system, and it has a very large private system. The private system's purchases are medical schemes. Medical schemes are funders, they're health insurers, but they also form parts of a fairly complex system of purchasing, where third-party administrators, managed care companies, and all sorts of arrangements in place to theoretically procure efficiently at the level of a medical fund. The public sector is a provincialized system in terms of a constitutional allocation of functions. So it's important to understand that provincial governments have been allocated the function health services by the Constitution. So it's actually a constitutionally allocated or assigned function which can't just be removed. But what are the implications of that? Well, the provincial departments, provincial governments are effectively in a position to legislate for healthcare, that's public and private healthcare, because the function that has been allocated to them is just called health services. So it's pretty much everything that you could think of falls within that framework. So everything required to run health services for the province, public or private, can be done by a province. It's not that the provinces have necessarily exercised all the powers that they have, but those are the powers they do have. Currently, South Africa's public health system is funded through a set of national allocations. And just as part of the NHI discussion, it's important to understand a sort of a key distinction here. Provincial governments are financed effectively in two basic ways, substantially. One is what's called a provincial equitable share allocation. The provincial equitable share allocation is what's called an unallocated block grant given to the provinces, and it's allocated on the basis of a risk-adjusted formula, a general risk-adjusted formula. And the question is, why is it unallocated? Unallocated means it's been given to provinces without any conditions attached. It comes in as revenue. And the reason that this exists is because provincial governments, given their powers that are allocated by the Constitution, technically can raise their own finances from their own taxes. But the problem is that we created 9 provinces with very, very different economies. And if each province had to finance its healthcare from its own revenue that it would generate from taxes, you would have a very, very uneven distribution of key functions in South Africa. So what was discussed was 2 modalities to solve that problem. One was let them raise taxes, and then there will be an equalization formula for those taxes, so-called tax capacity equalization structure. The alternative was to raise a national tax and allocate it down unconditionally. You might think, why am I going into all of this? Well, it's quite pertinent to the issue of the NHI, because the provincial equitable share allocation is in lieu of taxes that the provinces would raise themselves. It's not actually national money. The fact that national has raised it is just a method that is more efficient than a tax capacity equalization formula, which would involve the provinces raising their own taxes. So it's actually in lieu of taxes, and therefore it's not national money, even though it looks like it. And then there's a portion that's allocated to provinces that is national money. It's conditional grants. And this is for tertiary services, health professions training and development, and for HIV and AIDS and TB, inter alia. So the conditional allocations are given largely as a top-up because of the unevenness in the provinces as well. There are academic facilities in some provinces, not in others, and so this uneven balance in the distribution of services needs to compensate for cross-boundary flows between the provinces. So without going into too much detail, these are 2 big allocations, conditional grants and a provincial equitable share, which are largely in lieu of provincial revenues. So the NHI proposes to do away with all of that. It says we're not going to allocate this money to provinces, we're going to keep it at national, and we're going to buy the services ourselves. Provincial health services would become agents of the national department of national government, and they would just be contracting with national government. So the functional allocation to provinces would cease to have any substance to them. In the case of medical schemes, the proposal is that medical schemes would be prohibited from purchasing any healthcare services that the National Health Insurance is actually funding. So if it's in the package for National Health Insurance, then medical schemes can't cover it, so-called Section 33 of the bill. So these are 2 very, very big proposals involving substantial change in which 2 quite established systems, not working perfectly, would be effectively eliminated and consolidated into a completely new 3rd system in which everything would be purchased centrally. And the reason I'm kind of going through this is that the practical features of this proposal are almost unworkable. And there is the bill itself, the National Health Insurance Bill, which specifies a sort of a framework of how, a legislative framework, doesn't actually fill in the blanks. It's very difficult to work out from that how a whole bunch of things that are incredibly complex technically would now be achieved. So this consolidation is what's often referred to in policies as sort of non-incremental policy change. It's a big policy change. And most policy changes are incremental in nature. They move gradually over time. So the issue about NHI as proposed is that it's likely to be challenged. Both of those 2 systems that I've proposed are very unlikely to ever come into existence without substantial and potentially successful legal challenge. In the case of the provincial allocations, it's very likely that the right for provinces to run their own health services will be asserted in a constitutional challenge. And in the case of medical schemes being prohibited from being able to fund anything funded through the NHI would also be challenged on the basis that it is not a reasonable proposal. So it is a restrictive intervention where the public purpose is not actually properly defined. And to date, NHI hasn't really had a technical analysis that actually shows why you would choose this rather than that option. It's just been chosen. So the Bill of Rights, which is important to understand, has kind of 2 features that you would potentially test legislation against. One is rational grounds. Does the piece of legislation rationally relate to its objectives? The second is reasonableness. If you're going to limit a protected right within the Constitution, then you have to follow a set of guidelines on what you would, on how you would achieve that. And one of the tests would be of reasonableness is that you should actually consider less onerous ways of achieving the same objective. And for that, no analysis has been done. So it's going to be a problematic court case. So the reality is that NHI is going to go to court if any real feature of the current bill gets taken forward. In terms of centralized procurement and medicines, there are enormous challenges in the current environment. So currently we have a big private system and we have a big public system. And we've got aspects of the public system that are centralized and aspects of the private system that are centralized through the single exit pricing framework. These frameworks require remodeling. They're not in the current proposals. And what's going to happen going forward, and I'll conclude with this, is that essentially what we're going to see is pretty much more of the same. No real substantial change in national policy frameworks for medicines price determination, probably some sort of vague transitions in the case of national state procurement, but nothing really substantial. And no real innovation overall, nothing really substantive in relation to IP policy either. And so we're actually in a situation where nothing, probably for the foreseeable future, is going to change, and that is the context within which we are operating at this moment.
Thank you so much, Prof. Evidently, we've got a lot of thinking to do as a country as we are processing this particular legislative process. So we'll have time for questions for Prof. Alex as we have concluded all the presentations. One of the things that came up in the morning, it surely came from Professor Bhavesh Khanna, who spoke about innovation that emanates from academic institutions, and that is beginning to go commercial and have to deal with the funders and reimbursement. And he explained that that's quite a complex environment, particularly for academics who are not so familiar with that. So what we're going to be talking about next is issues related to access as well as reimbursement, and as it impacts on pricing as well. And to take us through that, we're going to have Professor Tini Stander, who will talk to such issues, and then he will be followed by Prof. Jack Sneyman, who's joining us virtually, and then we will take it from there. Thank you so much. Please help me welcome Professor Stander.
Thank you. I am quite sure if I was a betting man, I would have put money on this. If I could ask the GMs of pharmaceutical companies in South Africa today, what is your big one challenge? I would guess that more than 80, maybe 90% of them will unanimously say access. Access, access, access. That's my problem. If you can solve that, I'm a happy man. And in my short talk, I'm going to try and do these 5 slides. I want to talk about an inconvenient truth that unfortunately in innovation, there's a price to be paid. And when we take price as part of the problem and only focus on price, I call it price myopia. And then there are certain given unintentional consequences if we only focus on price. It's like if we had lunch this afternoon and we said, oh, no, there's too much chilies in the curry, get rid of the curry. I'm not trying to say price is not important. Price is important. I think the emphasis is wrong. I think there's too much chilies in the, no, this curry was fantastic, honestly. But I would only then say there's too much chili in the, I don't want to do away with it. I don't want to do away with discussions about price, but let's talk about that. And this myopia, short-sightedness, leads to equations in our minds where we think price equals expensive. They are the same thing. It leads us to think that just listening to price, no, this is unaffordable. It says that price and affordability is actually the same thing. Costs are too high. We then immediately start confusing two concepts. Price and cost is different. If we think about South Africa, we have single exit price, not single exit cost. And one of the things I'd like to focus on is that, semantically at least, let's start talking the same language. Price is specifically different than cost. You have a cost to produce a drug because it makes up many different components, but it translates into a price. Let's look into that a little bit further. Oi, what's happening there? Okay, that's nice. No, I didn't plan for that. Part of the problem of price is that I think, especially when we consulted in the funding industry, that inflation and price were basically seen as the same thing. Now, inflation has many components. And in the consumption industry, or on the demand side, we see that there's two components. There is price inflation. Drugs do get more expensive, sometimes, not always. But there's potentially annual and inflationary increase in drug prices. But there's another big one, which is utilization inflation. In other words, that the drug gets used more. Now, these two, for me, are completely different. The one, in some way, you can control through pricing, but utilization you cannot control through pricing. This is a decision by a physician, a prescriber, a patient demand. It could be a fact that there's more indications registered. But we need to be cognizant that there are two parts to price and to inflation. We can't just say it's getting more and more expensive. Now, that's all I want to say about price. And I want to move to cost. So what is cost? In my opinion, we need to make sure that when we talk about price, we know that it's the price of a single entity, the price of a drug. My Panado costs X rand %. And when we talk cost, then cost is technically P1 plus P2 plus P3. It's the combination of many prices. So if we think about a disease, we're not treating a drug, we're treating a disease. As physicians, we would say the cost of treating diabetes is X rand. And that means there's a price for the drug, there's a price for consultation, there's a price for BMGC, or whatever the case. It's P1, P2, P3. We add them all up and we come to a cost. So I would also plead and say that we often confuse price and cost. We say, the price is too high. Well, maybe. Maybe the price of not doing it is too high. The cost is too high. So I think it's really important that when we start conversing about these very important and difficult things, that we focus on using the right names. And ultimately what we want to get to is value. It's my second last slide. We want to make sure that we focus on value. And we really want to get to a point. My plea is that we should get to value-based healthcare, where what's valuable for the patient, that's the starting discussion. Price would come into it. Price would be part of that discussion, but if we start with the value for a patient, we would be happier. So in summary, what I want to say, we need to be careful of getting misled by price inflation only thinking about price inflation. There's demand, there's utilization inflation. We need to think about value-based healthcare. And my biggest concern is, if we think about behavioral economics, there's amazing scientists like Kahneman and his partners taught us that to change behavior, the power of fear is much more, almost double the power of getting a benefit. The power of losing something is much more than the power of gaining. And if we start our mindset with price and, oh, it's too high, then I think we're losing so much opportunity to provide access to patients. Whereas if we start with what is good for the patients, what is the benefit that the patient can, and eventually get to price, and still maybe deciding this is not affordable. I think we will get much more access. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Prof. Right away, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to call online Professor Jack Snyman. He's going to speak on alternative reimbursement models. Prof. Snyman, are you with us? Are you ready? Clearly, sir.
I'm just sharing my slides. If you can see them, I'll be happy.
We can see them. I don't know if you want to put them on the presentation mode. Fantastic. Thank you so much.
So we all agree with this. Doesn't matter where in the world you sit, there's a finite amount of money. There's resource constraints, there's capacity, inequalities between what is paid for by and provided from by state sectors, while it's private. And if you look in Africa alone, your logistics and facilities also restrain or restricts people from getting access. Then again, we've seen the high cost of innovation and the inequality of actually doing that. So one of my disclosures that I haven't got on that, I've also contributed to quite a number of patents, some of those commercialized, and some of them post their patent life, but it's significant amounts of money that needs to be invested into getting a patent off the ground and then to maintain a patent. So if a patent is not commercialized early on, it's a total waste of money. So the problem that we sit with in healthcare, if the funder, whether it's the government or an insurer, you sit with the same problem. The person ordering the service does not get the service. The person receiving the service does not pay for the service. And the provider of the service doesn't determine what they get paid for the service. For instance, if the funder determines the price and the payer for the service determines the price but does not receive the service. It's a completely disjointed system. Feeding into what Tini has explained is that we then get focused on price and not the total cost of care. Many of these newer molecules lend themselves to alternative reimbursement, where we look at value. So moving away from the current reimbursement, where reimbursement actually favors actions and frequencies. The more you see the doctor, the more you can get, the more of the specific medicine you use, the more you can get, versus translating that in paying for the particular outcome. So you want to transfer the risk to the provider. The provider of the services, the doctor, the clinic, the facility, or the technology provider, the device or the medicine. So value-based reimbursement versus fee-for-service, two completely different models depend on the environment and the intent. So it depends on where, what you are trying to achieve. With other words, what is the magnitude of the problem? And sometimes, if we look at some of those orphan diseases where you've only got 100 patients in a country like South Africa, then perhaps if you spend R1 million to save 1 out of every 3 patients from dying at 6 months, but you extend life expectancy way beyond 5 years, maybe that is not expensive. So it all depends on how you view that particular value of that particular individual. So when we look at equality and access to care, sometimes R1 million is not that unequal. So we need to look at, can we measure the outcomes? Can I measure the clinical outcomes? And can I measure the financial outcomes? And can I transport them in order for them to be centrally available to be adjudicated all the time, so that you follow that over time? And obviously the engagement with patients, and then obviously transparency, visibility, and of the model, and the outcome must be tangible. So if it doesn't deliver, it needs to be scrapped. So if we look at just a brief definition of value-based care, you will see that value-based care is, or payment is a concept by which purchaser of healthcare, the government, the payer, and the payers hold the healthcare delivery system at large accountable both for quality and cost of care. So if you look at alternative reimbursement models for pharmaceutical products, or when you're paying clinicians for doing a procedure, it's in essence exactly the same. You're keeping the provider of that particular service or the inventor of that particular molecule accountable for the outcome that you claim that particular molecule will have. So if you look at that, the patients will achieve better health outcomes. Providers will achieve better satisfaction, increase the focus on value rather on volume. Payers control the cost and reduce risk. So the payers' benefit is that the cost of care comes down if it is modeled correctly, and we understand that we're not fixated on price. And if you look at the supplier of the technology, the supplier benefit from being able to align their product and service with a positive patient outcome and reduce costs. So if essentially you pay for a positive outcome, but you do not reimburse or fund a negative outcome in that particular sense. So just to summarize, pay for performance models offer incentives based on the performance, the quality metrics that can be discussed up front, and that holds true for a medicine. When is it failing and when is it successful? When do I continue pay at the set price by the manufacturer, or when do I get my money back? In other words, it's a money back guarantee. So there should be a risk-reward pathway in these shared programs so that we can actually understand what is the risk we pay. So these programs require actually additional investment in technology, because I need to understand, as I said before, the clinical outcomes and the financial outcomes over time, and those needs to be monitored in order to allow for this risk-reward systems. So if we focus only on pharmaceuticals, you can look at risk sharing or you risk transfer. You transfer the risk of failure of the molecule to the manufacturer of that particular molecule. If you want to, a good example of that is to say that if a patient only responds, let's take oncology, only 1 out of 3 patients will respond, will have a response at 3 months. If you do not respond at 3 months, you get 100% back of the particular money that you put in, or what you purchased for, because it's failure of therapy. I don't want to pay for failure. But the patient needs to meet certain inclusion criteria, which set by arm's length from the prescriber or from the funder, so that it is a fair process. Then your patient meets a stop or continuation criteria. That's why you need the technology. So you measure over time and says, yes, the patient is responding to the treatment. This could be, as I said, non-oncology medicine within 3 or 6 months, or you may have a long time horizon in 5 years. In the UK, we have got examples of hepatitis, different forms of hepatitis being treated with exactly the same molecule, but your genetic marker differentiates whether you're a good responder or a poor responder. And your risk transfer model depends on your genetic component of the patient receiving that medicine. So in certain instances, you pay more for the medicine, or you reimburse more for failure purely because of the chance of failure within that particular environment. So you may have the same molecule but different diseases, or you may have different diseases with the same molecule. And we have those examples in Italy and UK. They are well published. You do not have to reinvent the wheel. You can just follow it. So risk settlement is if the risk, so you need to upfront agree on the risk that you will accept, or the funder will accept, and also the manufacturer will accept. So funder is then refunded for the medicine cost if there's no benefit achieved by that, or if the benefit is only partially achieved, you can then agree on what is a partial refund for that particular thing. This data then feeds into the future, where you can say, but the molecule that you've presented is not worth what you're charging, and therefore we are going to pay less, irrespective of the model that we've now agreed on, purely because we can see that the response rate in real life is far lower than what you've seen in the for instance, the phase 3 clinical study. So the data collection makes future planning also more possible. The obstacles, for instance, for alternative reimbursement models, we need to be able to negotiate them. Yes, this is the last slide.
I'm so sorry to interject. I'm going to ask you to begin to wrap up, please.
Yeah, this is the last slide.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, so your regulatory environment, you obviously, we cannot employ clinicians in certain countries as a facility. Price control, differential pricing, and reference pricing, all of those make a difference to what we see. Unintended consequences of that, we increase inequality because the rich have better outcomes, a better choice. And we also may see disinvestment in healthcare technology, too high risk, too low return. Or we may even see regional disinvestment where countries specifically excluded from new interventions, and then they will have no access. And that is the end. Thank you, audience.
Thank you so very much. That was quite insightful. What we're going to do now is that we have 10 minutes to go through Q&A, and I'm going to ask Vyokazi to start immediately what we had. So the two profs spoke about alternative reimbursement models and access. So if I can give you 5 minutes to just facilitate a dialogue and probe those issues, you can involve the audience in the process as well. Don't know if you want to come to the podium or you're comfortable there.
Well, okay, so I see my speaker, my microphone is working, so I'm quite happy to stay seated here. But first I want to thank you, Godfrey, for your allyship in calling me up and recognition. I may be a little bit far from the panel, but I feel very close. So may take slightly more than 5 minutes.
Sorry, can I just confirm that everybody can hear Voyo? Is you audible? Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. I'm just saying, I may take just a little over 5 minutes, Godfrey, because the panelists have given such rich presentations, and I'd like to at least pose one question to each linked to the issues. So I want to first start on Professor Stander's comment about access. And I think whether you're talking IP or the NHI, or you're talking about pricing and ARMs, it's about access. And he mentioned that 90% to 100% of pharma executives would say this is their biggest challenge. But I would say that this is probably the biggest challenge for pharmaceuticals and manufacturers in general, for policymakers, for payers, which Dr. Snyman spoke to providers who often just want access in a medicine's toolkit to help for outcomes, and most importantly for patients who expect that when they need assistance and support from the health system, they'll simply get it. So when we talk about IP, when we talk about NHI, we talk about ARMs, these are different ways in which we are all approaching the question and the challenge of access. Now, going back to IP, Dr. Spand, I think it was really fascinating, the presentation you provided, but I was really interested in the point you made about the fact that IP is territorial. And I know you didn't want to talk too much about the TRIPS waiver, but I think the question I've always had, and I think which is relevant for many in the audience, is if IP is territorial and compulsory licensing happens within certain conditions under TRIPS, what would be a suitable environment for compulsory licensing to take place? And when I say that, would it, for example, be able to take place if IP is not, if the medicine or the product is not registered in the country or doesn't hold a patent within a particular territory? Would there be an option to actually utilize compulsory licensing according to TRIPS within that context?
Yeah, so no, thank you very much for the question. So I think when we look at the issue of territoriality, so I mean, let's use two countries. Let's take Ghana, maybe three countries: Ghana, South Africa, and the United States. And there's a particular, patent in the United States for a drug. Let's say it's for HPV. In the United States, and there is an equivalent in Ghana, but there isn't any in South Africa. And they say there's some huge, pandemic that happens, HPV, related in South Africa. In essence, I mean, there's no need to even, look at compulsory licensing, because what are you going to be licensing? There's no patent in South Africa. But if it was, let's say, global, pandemic, or sub-Saharan, Africa, in Ghana, there is a patent. The first, stance would be for government to try to negotiate with the owner of the patent for access. And in the event that there is no access, then they could then revoke, in essence, the compulsory licensing provisions. So I think that becomes quite important. And so when we talk about, TRIPS, the IP waivers and so forth, people don't really think carefully around the issue of territoriality. Because if it's not protected in your country, you can copy, you can use. It all then boils down to know-how, and know-how, my view is that you cannot have compulsory licensing of know-how. Because how are you going to force me to tell you what is my secret?
Understood.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. And I think perhaps for those products that are easier to reverse engineer, then know-how becomes less of an issue. But it obviously requires that there are technical expertise that already exist in country.
Yeah.
I think the other thing that's really important, and we've seen in the pandemic, the challenges linked with equity and access. And there has been a lot of voluntary licensing, which I think has been probably the most sustainable, means through which to avail access on an equitable basis. But one of the biggest challenges we've seen is also access to markets. And so we've seen that, for example, Johnson & Johnson did licensing with Aspen. I believe Pfizer did something similar with Biovac. And MSD actually had voluntary licensing strategy as part of their access for COVID-19 therapeutics from the start. However, with the inability to have sufficient procurement on the continent and a lack of health-seeking behavior that drove vaccine uptakes, it's irrelevant as well if you can have a license, if you're not able to commercialize it.
Yeah.
And so I think it's really important that we think about all the areas that are relevant for access and not only think about IP, because a license can be availed that yields zero fruit. The next question I'd like to ask is to Professor van der Heever, who spoke about the NHI, and we have all heard about the inequities that exist in both the public and private sectors, which I think that the NHI is aiming to resolve. And I noted in your presentation, and I am inclined to agree, that it is likely to be challenged legally. on constitutional grounds. But given the challenges we have as a country, I think my question to you is, well, twofold. Firstly, what would it take for an NHI to work? Because universal health coverage is important. And secondly, and maybe it's linked to that, if not the NHI, then what?
Thanks for those. I mean, I think that the first issue on the inequities between public and private need to be understood. It's extremely complex, and it's not necessarily what most people perceive it to be. The mere fact that somebody is spending per capita more than the state doesn't imply that you have an inequitable scenario in place, because you're spending out-of-pocket income, post-tax income for that. So the issue really is achieving equity is not about establishing a single purchaser, it's about your subsidies, your systems of subsidies, your resource allocation mechanisms. So resource allocation mechanisms are part of defining or designing universal coverage models in every country where you have coherent models. You don't have to design a resource allocation or subsidy system through a single purchaser, because you're very often subsidizing other purchases. So for instance, it's absolutely legitimate to say, well, what should we be redistributing in South Africa? You decide on that in your mechanism, and then you redistribute to the various purchasers that are then responsible for actually purchasing the care. Now, so the equity then is achieved through the allocation of subsidies. That's how you do it in every system, any part of a social security system, any education system, that's how you do it. The problem, and you asked the question about NHI, the proposal in NHI is a very unusual one, because what it's saying is we're going to raise taxes equivalent to what private sector is spending, and we're going to consolidate that into a single purchaser, and that will be equitable. And what they're essentially attempting to do is to sort of put a square peg through a round hole. That tax increase is not going to be able to fund a package of services that everybody's going to be willing to accept. It also implies that you're going to be willing to accept the package that the state is going to buy on your behalf. It just won't be the case. And South Africa, as a developing country, we're going to have people who are not prepared to accept that package. So the issue is subsidize people, but allow them to choose their care. And so that is very consistent with universal coverage models around the world. There are no countries where you raise taxes in order to fund a covered group. This, I think, is one of the anomalies in South Africa, is typically you would have in developing countries a group of people who don't have cover. You would then raise taxes to cover them. The anomaly in the South African proposal is all the tax increases are to fund medical scheme members. This doesn't make sense and is very unlikely to result in a substitution into a single purchaser. And it hasn't really been thought through. So as I said, there are very successful universal coverage models. You get the subsidy regimes right, and you regulate the purchasing models correctly. They would be very, and can be introduced incrementally. And the proposal that's on the table is just, creates insurmountable implementation obstacles, which means that it's just not going to happen in that way.
Thank you so much. So then moving swiftly, and I know that the timekeeper's looking at me. So I'm going to go to Dr. Snyman before I come back to you, Professor Stander. So in the presentation about alternative reimbursement models, what I take away is that risk sharing is important because funds are finite and payers have to manage for budget impact. However, and the risk sharing must also be based on value and outcomes. However, if we look at the Medicines Act and we look at the Public Finance Management Act, we see that procurement, if you're thinking about government as a payer, but also if you think about private funders, risk-sharing agreements or outcomes-based models, or ARMs as you put it, are limited. And in fact, the only or the sole focus of availing access is in price. So PFMA will say the lowest price possible. For funders and private funders, it will simply be, I need to manage my budget impact. I'm not allowed to enter into risk sharing with manufacturers. I'm not allowed to get a discount and enter into a volume-based agreement. So the only mechanism that exists in South Africa, written into laws, is price. So my question, and I think this is also quite important because South Africa is the only country globally, many may not know, that has legislated net price visibility. And in an environment globally where you have international reference pricing, when you have a single exit price, which is your net only price that can be sold, and it is transparent, it means countries across the world are able to reference South African prices. So you have this single exit pricing, legislated net price visibility, mechanism for access is only price, and it's visible. And every country can look at it and negotiate on its basis with manufacturers. So that's the problem statement. So Dr. Snyman, my question to you is, I know that there are a number of social actors and players that have come together in what is called the Alternative Reimbursement Models Coalition, which includes, as I understand, patient advocacy groups, it includes private funders, it includes pharmaceuticals, but very little has happened. So really, what needs to happen, first of all, to take this conversation forward, and also what needs to happen to create the legislative space for alternative reimbursement models?
In short, so I think there's a way around it, and we've actually find a legal path to do risk-sharing models without affecting your SEP or the price within that. If there's a risk taker in the middle between the manufacturer and the purchaser, so that can be done. So that's not an unsurmountable obstacle, and there are legal paths to do that, so that the price that is displayed is still absolutely the correct price, and you adhere to the legal framework within that. One of the obstacles that you mentioned is indeed the state, because the state would want to purchase on a tender basis or a very specific process, which actually jeopardizes the state in participating in a risk-sharing model, and I think that is something that needs to be explored wider to allow for that to happen. Just as an example, South Africa paid for trastuzumab 20% more than the patients in UK and Germany, purely because our price was transparent and we were not allowed to have any discount for that product for treating of patients with breast cancer. So that is unacceptable. If there's an obstacle that prevents you from doing that. So the one is the obstacle is the legal obstacle, which I think there's a way around. But there's an implementation obstacle, and that is the problem that you see with the funder, and I'm talking about the medical schemes. So as soon as medical schemes are mutualities, but the pricing is done in such a way as to make sure that there's cross-subsidization between the different options. I mean, that is a different thing that we can discuss at a later stage. But the problem is that your actuary will tell you is that you don't want people that buy a high option, who now cross-subsidizes a lower option, would actually buy down because they can get exactly the same medicine on a lower option. So there's a fear of anti-selection as soon as you start making medicines more available on the lower options. And for me, that is, I've got an ethical moral dilemma there. And because if you look at orphan diseases and very high-cost medicines, patients will not move because the perception is that they now have access to a specific medicine in future when they would have a very specific disease, for instance, say a malignant melanoma. So I think there's a mindset change that's required within your funder environment when you talk about medical schemes, and then there's also a regulatory environment within your state sector to allow for these sort of risk-sharing agreements going forward.
And my last question to Professor Standard, and going back to the question of value, which you said I think should underpin everything. I've just articulated some of the legislations that talk so much about price and where we emphasize this so much. How do you think we move forward as a country, practically perhaps, to get that shift towards value as stakeholders?
Yeah, so we sit with a recipe with components, and I think we mix them wrong. My opinion is we shouldn't start with price. We should start with what is valuable for the patient. It's simply starting from the other side. Price will be part of the discussion. It will form part of the negotiation. But I think we should first know, is this beneficial for the patient? If not, move on, get it out of the way. I'll give you an example. If there's an oncology drug that costs R1 million and provides 1 month additional life, we don't want to consider that. We're not into that. It's an easy decision. Move on. Don't even talk price. So let's start with value, and ultimately we will get to price, and ultimately there will be price negotiations, and ultimately we hopefully will get to alternative reimbursement. So,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for masterfully getting quite incisive and probing questions. It will be unfair not to take 2 questions from the audience. Please do state to whom your question is addressed. I will recognize hands. There's a hand there, Essa. If you can come close to the microphone.
Thanks, facilitator. My question is directed to Alex. We know that the Department of Health has said that the HMI inquiries recommendations, the health market inquiries recommendations are not binding on the Department of Health. And that's probably because they want to ensure that nothing stops NHI from being implemented the way they want it. Is there any tension that you see between the HMI recommendations and government being able to implement NHI? Thanks.
Thank you. Any other question? So thank you very much, Prof. Alex.
Yeah, so the only tension that technically exists is that the sustainability of the private health system undermines the rationale for a single purchase model. But it doesn't undermine the rationale for a coherent universal coverage model. So the HMI recommendations really talk to the structural weaknesses of the way in which this Department of Health that does it.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to ask you to please join me in a round of applause to thank our speakers for an excellent session. Thank you very much for your attention, and have a good afternoon further. I believe we have another session on clinical trials.